Hello everyone, and welcome to The History of the Fourth Era. Episode 3, An Overview of Tamriel After the Oblivion Crisis, Part 2. My name is Zach, and I'll be your host as we explore the political and cultural atmosphere of Tamriel in the years following the Oblivion Crisis, leading up to the events of Skyrim. With me is a suite of other writers and thinkers who have helped shape this narrative and our philosophy of how to approach these topics. Each episode, we will explore the provinces and their happenings, starting from the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis and moving forwards. Last week, we talked about the provinces that will have some of the most serious geopolitical consequences after the Oblivion Crisis: Alinor, Morrowind, and Blackmarsh. Even though the crisis unfolded in different ways in each province, they were all left with a strong nationalist wave and a weak imperial infrastructure to deal with it. The extent to which the Empire had a presence in each province was different as well, but so too was the crisis itself. It didn't matter that significantly fewer gates were opened in Blackmarsh than in Alinor or Morrowind. There were way less imperial forces there. They were screwed nonetheless. By this point, the power vacuum had formed. It should come as no surprise that the desperate populace turned to the most militant and most fervorous factions to help keep order. It was the beginning of the end of imperial control in these territories. Today, we'll see similar patterns of imperial decay and nationalist sentiments in southern Tamriel once again in Elsweyr and Valenwood. But we'll see something different in the north. After all, these are the heartland territories of the Empire. Sure, Cyrodiil would throw Blackmarsh or Elsweyr under the bus for its own benefit, but what about Skyrim? Or Highrock? We're starting to venture into the territories that are more of a benefit to the Empire than a cost to it. In these places, we'll see 4 distinct factors that helped them fare better than the South. First, there were just larger garrisons there. Second, these garrisons were, for the most part, recruited locally. This will definitely be a problem in the future, but for now, it's a benefit. Third, all of these provinces are particularly wealthy, at least compared to most nations in the south. Lastly, there wasn't that much Daedra worship. Definitely less so in Skyrim and Hammerfell than in Highrock, but still. You'd think that the Mythic Dawn would be interested in destabilizing these wealthy provinces too, but maybe hindsight's 2020. After all, they still did a great job of fracturing the Empire. Maybe there's something more to their plan than we're giving them credit for. But let's wrap up our tour of the South first before we explore the northern provinces. It should come as no surprise to you all that Elsweyr and Valenwood were not at the top of the Empire's priority list. Ever. The Bosmer have almost no interest in global trade, and the Khajiit have a completely different approach to trade and mercantilism. Both provinces have pretty harsh terrain, but nothing akin to Blackmarsh. They both tend to dislike the Empire, but never assemble in mass revolt against it. It's not really a, we can't govern this place, more so, we don't really want to govern this place sort of take. But they don't cause trouble, and they get a little bit of taxes from them, so good enough, I guess. The story of these provinces leading up to the Oblivion Crisis is less duplicitous than other places we've talked about, so we'll jump straight into the crisis. Also, we've got 5 provinces to talk about today. We'll be here forever if we get stuck in the nitty-gritty. So, let's start with Valenwood. Of all Tamriel, Valenwood would probably take first prize for chaos during the Oblivion Crisis. Imagine the harsh terrain of Blackmarsh without a sentient tree hive mind using telepathy to coordinate a defense. And locals that don't want to eat plants, the literal most abundant thing around them, even when the going gets rough. And an empire that has no idea how to navigate the forest and is perfectly content with eating the plants and angering the locals as they go through it. Even with virtually no Daedra worship in the province, the Mythic Dawn only needed to open a handful of gates to collapse this house of cards. An interesting issue that the hordes had to contend with in this province is that most of the major cities are in migratory trees in one way or another, even if they're dormant at that point. Not that the cities can outpace the Daedra, but it's hard to besiege a place when it's always on the move. The best case of this was the Battle of Valenwood. A gate opened, the battle began, and the spinners used their magic to unroot the Elden Tree again, which was previously thought to have gone dormant. The result was a long, drawn-out hit-and-run skirmish with the hordes, which, honestly, suited the Bosmer incredibly well. You can have a handful of archers that delay entire armies. You can bounce from tree to tree until your enemy realizes that the trees are the biggest problem. Despite their eventual victory over the Daedra, a huge portion of the Malabal Tor region was burned down. The Elden Tree of Valenwood stopped moving and it stopped producing leaves. Interestingly, the ooze wasn't destroyed. For those of you that don't know what that is, it's the resting place for the Oathbreakers. This was considered an omen for much of the more traditional Bosmer sects. One of the most sacred forests was damaged, but not the one place where the heretical Bosmer are interred. This is an interesting spark of nationalism for Valenwood because it doesn't really get directed towards any one particular enemy. Do you think the Empire did it? The Khajiits? The Wood Orcs? That's up to individual clan interpretations, and that's exactly what happens. Retaliatory raids become common across Malabal Tor as the Bosmer strike out against non-Wood Elves and even amongst themselves, using the tension to advance old rivalries. Further to the south, things are going a lot worse. Down in Greenshade, the locals don't have the luxury of super dense forests for their guerrilla tactics. Even to the east, Eldenroot didn't fare well in the thick jungle either. The guerrilla tactics seen at Valenwood can't work when the Elden Tree no longer moves. The Daedra were able to easily besiege Eldenroot, and the populace quickly fell into famine. Again, this lined up pretty nicely for the nationalists, who never parted from their beliefs of ritualistic cannibalism. What comes from this is a bizarre cycle of starvation and cannibalism that quickly picked up momentum across the entirety of southern Valenwood. Particularly in Eldenroot, the siege was the most defining event for the future of Valenwood. Part of the reason for this was that both the Sylvanar and the Green Lady were in the city for a clan ceremony. Both the physical and spiritual embodiments of the Bosmer in one city during an apocalypse was always going to be a recipe for disaster, but also hope. Even before the siege had finished, the 20th Imperial Legion withdrew from the city for food and reinforcements from the north, and it was up to the Sylvanar, a short, younger Bosmer by the name of Malowin, to try to lead the local militias in defense. It didn't take a genius to see that the situation was only going to get worse and worse, and Malowin led the militia out in a last-ditch defense. It didn't go very well. But it was a sacrifice that ended up saving the city. Upon the death of the Sylvanar, Green Lady Geniel began devolving into a violent rage. The local Queen Ulandra saw the writing on the wall. One, she needed to get Geniel out of the city before she tried to destroy it. And two, the city would be lost regardless unless something desperate was done. In a last-ditch defense of the city, Queen Ulandra and her royal guard invoked the Wild Hunt. The issue of the Wild Hunt is a controversial one among Bosmer. While it is an awe-inspiring ability, it is irreversible, and the more progressive elements of their society consider it barbaric. We couldn't exactly ask a Bosmer who's invoked it how it feels, as there's no going back once it happens. It's only been recorded a handful of times in modern history, and the Bosmer often think of it as a savage relic of their past. But when the Wild Hunt is invoked to defend Eldenroot, it feels different this time. This sort of martyrdom was exactly what the traditionalists were looking for. Ulandra and Geniel led the monstrous beasts outside of the city, battled the Daedra, and destroyed the gate itself before wandering off into the forest on a bloody rampage. To see their leaders sacrifice themselves, take on a primordial state to battle Mehrunes Dagon when all hope seems lost, how would that not make you proud to be a Bosmer? While all of this is going on, the Legion is getting lost in the jungles and starving on their hapless marches. While the core garrison of the 28th Legion in Woodhearth was pretty successful at holding back the Daedra, everyone else was struggling. As we previously mentioned, the 20th had withdrawn from Eldenroot when the fighting got too bad, and it was organizing what soldiers it had left across its disparate outposts. The significant majority of the legions posted here were not native, meaning they had to rely entirely on locals to navigate the dense forest. This did not go very well. Whether due to the guides themselves being unable to navigate, not understanding the purpose of the mission, or simply deceiving the soldiers, several detachments from the legions were simply lost to the jungle. Who the Daedra didn't kill, starvation did. They were largely unable to find edible fruits and vegetables because many of their Bosmer guides were traditionalists, who still followed the Green Pact and simply didn't know what was edible. So the legions either spent most of their time hunting animals just to survive, laying low because their soldiers were too hungry and tired to march, or those that plundered the Bosmer for supplies. Perhaps the most infamous case of all was that done by Legate Metius Hardalius, commander of the 28th Legion. He was actually with a detachment in Greenhearth when the crisis began, and they tried to head back to their base to regroup. Their guides led them north to Marbrook, where, technically, the Daedra were raiding. They were able to repel the hordes, which was good, but that wasn't the point of the march. Now you have an entire unit of soldiers who are hungry, out of supplies, and still a week away from their headquarters. The legionnaires decided to rob the locals of food and supplies, and Metius ordered it. In the ensuing chaos, dozens of citizens were killed by the starving soldiers. Probably not the best way to gain the trust of the locals. This event would go down as the Marbrook Massacre and would be a permanent stain on the Empire for the remainder of the time it would be in Valenwood, which is not that much longer. So I think that's where we'll leave Valenwood for now. A chaotic fluster of guerrilla tactics in moving cities, Bosmer taking pride in their wild hunt and cannibalism, and the Empire struggling to support its troops, with them taking it out on the locals. For a place that already has strong ties to the Aldmeri Dominion of old, it's a good tinderbox for the Thalmor to capitalize on. The last province in the south of Tamriel to discuss is Elswire, the land of the perfect society being somewhere else. The Khajiit are often given the short end of the stick when it comes to geopolitics in Tamriel, in part because of their vastly different approaches to culture and societal norms. While this is certainly the case, this doesn't mean that their politics are primitive. For the most part, it largely resembles what we see in Highrock, actually. Large contrast between industrialist and primitivist factions, ancient aristocracies that divide the land into small petty rivalries. If Highrock was less in consensus about its relationship with the Empire, we would probably call it a confederacy too. It's in this tumultuous confederation of tribes and clans that we find our backdrop for the political scene of Elswire in the time leading up to the Oblivion crisis. As one can expect in a confederacy, its city-states weren't always on good terms with each other, and for us, not even the majority of the time. Beyond the rivalries between city-states, there was, of course, the cultural divide between the historic Palatine and Anakina regions, between the rich mercantile tribes of the south and the hardy warrior nomads of the north. Added on to this is the fact that the Main resides in Torval, the heartland of Palatine. It creates a weird dynamic relationship between the North and the South. The North likes gold and other valuables, which it needs from the South, which needs strong warriors from the North to help keep order. It works good for both sides, but who stands to lose more if the system completely collapses? My bet is the South. Sure, not having nice things sucks for Anakinna, but they're a hardened people used to a hardened life. The nice things are just a bonus here and there. It's that whole easy times creates weak people, hard times creates strong people sort of gist. Then again, who said everyone in Anakinna was still following the ways of their ancestors? After all, Rimmon and Riverhold are among the largest and most mercantile cities in Elsweyr, and they're both in Anakinna. A lot of Khajiit would happily settle down for a rich life in the city. I don't blame them. The Imperial situation before the crisis in Elsweyr wasn't very good, but it wasn't bad either. While the Empire wasn't exactly liked in Elsweyr, they weren't actively antagonized either. In the north, the legions had almost no presence outside of the cities. Not that there was something preventing them from going out there. It's desert and savanna. There's nothing out there for them. Let the nomads wander around. It's an interesting contrast with, say, Black Marsh, where the lack of presence was more due to the land being too difficult to traverse. In the south, the Empire had a bit stronger of a presence in Elsweyr, but it was never able to integrate itself into the local infrastructure. Much of the actual day-to-day governance of Palatine was fulfilled by Pajasat. So that's a Ta'agra word that roughly translates to one that gives money, and can mean anything from government officials in the best sense to mobsters and drug lords in the worst sense. The wealthiest Khajiit kept the order by whatever means necessary, and this power mostly ran through illegal avenues as far as the Empire was concerned. But they weren't in a position to object and interfere. Imperial presence in Elsweyr was pretty minimal in the first place, so their best option was to turn a blind eye to whatever the mercantile underworld was doing. In most cases, they were paid off by the Pajasat to stay quiet. The Empire stayed in its corner while the Khajiit had business as usual. Like the majority of southern Tamriel, there was not a big Mythic Dawn presence in the province, so there were far fewer gates which opened across Elsweyr. In terms of life lost, the Oblivion crisis didn't affect Elsweyr that much, but this is more due to actions the Khajiit took. First, lots of Elsweyr is uninhabited, either by choice or circumstance. If the fighting got too rough, you could hide out in the countryside. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the concept of military honor is an alien idea in Elsweyr, which at first sounds like a critique, but maybe they have the right idea in the first place. If you're outnumbered 10-1, why would you stand and fight? Is this chunk of land really that meaningful? If you're cornered and have no other option, then yeah. But the bigger thing is, don't put yourself in a corner. It's smarter to back off and wait until the fight is more favorable. It's here that we see how pragmatic of a people the Khajiit are. We talked a bit about Bosmer guerrilla tactics in the previous section, but the Khajiit are willing to take it to a whole new level. And this doesn't work well with the Empire, who are dedicated to stand and fight for their little patches of grass. The most disastrous of these events was the Battle of Senchal. The local Khajiiti militia, composed almost entirely of northern skirmishers and archers, wasn't ready to die for a city they were barely loyal to. When the Daedra began amassing outside the gates of Senchal, the militia scattered to the surrounding countryside. This panicked the 13th Legion that was stationed there, who were building their strategy around using those militia. There weren't enough soldiers to man the walls, and the hordes quickly broke through. Legate Lucius Hostus, commander of the Legion, had no choice but to order the soldiers to fight through the city in crude urban warfare. After nearly 3 days of fighting, the militia came back and began attacking the Daedra from behind, trapping them inside the city. After 3 days of fighting, the last of the hordes had been defeated, but not until the majority of the city had been destroyed and most of the 13th Legion had been wiped out. To the west, things went much worse for the Khajiit. The Daedra attacked Torval, and there wasn't an Imperial garrison to help defend. Considering that the Main resides in Torval, this was definitely a time they had to stand and fight. And it was rough. Like Senchal, the majority of the city was destroyed, the Main was severely wounded in battle, and the drug lord Yatirje, i.e. the Golden Cat, was killed as he tried to escape the city. For a relatively minor conflict in the province, it was devastating for Palatine. Its official base of power was severely disrupted, and the unofficial authority that the drug kingpin Yatirje had collapsed. It was the beginning of anarchy in the south. To the north, things actually went a lot better. Definitely not for the average Khajiit or Imperial, but for the nationalist image of Anakinna. At the Battle of Rimmon, the imperialized Khajiits try to stand their ground with the 17th Legion, but they all take a beating. They barely defeat the Daedra after days of fighting, and much of the city was leveled. But in the chaos, there is an inspiring event that rallies all of northern Elsweyr. The Exodus in the Scar, as it would come to be known, was a defining moment for the history of Anakinna and the entire province. The heroes of this story are the Sisbandar, a nomadic northern clan which were among the most numerous and prominent residents of Orcrest. When the Daedra came, they quickly surrounded the city. The citizens were preparing for a final stand when the Sisbandar chief Ashjo proposed an idea. Leave everything behind and break through the siege. All the gold, wealth, treasures, everything. Most of the citizens were outraged, but many joined with the Sisbandar. With just enough arrows to escape and supplies for just 2 days, they bursted through the city gates and pushed through. Although many Khajiit died in the escape, the majority made it. They pushed down the plateau and into the desert of the Scar, where they wandered for 2 months, surviving on what they could find. Those that stayed behind in Orcrest, however, suffered a much worse fate. They were slaughtered to the man, and the city was completely destroyed. At first glance, it takes a twisted mind to appreciate why Anakinna was so enamored by the Exodus of the Scar. Orcrest was completely leveled. They lost everything they owned. But that's the point. The Sisbandar survived. It was the epitome of the historic tribes of old, wandering through the northern deserts with nothing but the sacks on their shoulders. Look at what happened to Rimmon. Yes, the city survived, but countless Khajiiti lives were lost too. Look at what happened to Palatine. They cared so much about their possessions that they were too badly beaten. They couldn't even protect the Main, and their skooma operations collapsed. All of Elsweyr was greatly damaged, but many lives had been saved because of Khajiiti pragmatism, and the north was poised to exert ever more authority across the entire province. So this seems like a good place to leave off for Elsweyr, right? The complete collapse of Palatine, the incipient rise of Anakinna, and an imperial infrastructure too badly damaged to really help stabilize the situation. Now that our tour of the south is finished, let's head up north, starting with Hammerfell. Like we talked about at the start of this episode, the north is going to look a lot different from its southern counterparts. They're wealthy, have lots of imperial infrastructure, and are generally on good terms with Cyrodiil. We'll still see conflict, but they don't necessarily emerge from imperial negligence, but rather political ambitions from within the provinces. Actually, these places will be where most of the post-crisis problems come from. The affairs of the South after the crisis are fairly self-contained. What happens in Black Marsh stays in Black Marsh. What happens in Alinor stays in Alinor, at least for a little bit. In the north, the political ambitions will bleed out into the nearby territories, specifically Cyrodiil. Part of this is because the legions here were recruited locally. This is a problem that won't really be addressed until the reforms of Titus Mede nearly 2 decades later, and it will be a recurring issue throughout the Stormcrown interregnum. In Hammerfell, we will see the exact sort of clashes of political and military ambitions that will be ever present in the coming years. So, for starters, some clarifications about Hammerfell politics. Most people know about them as a constant struggle between the crowns and forebearers, but this is a lot of simplification. Yes, these are the two prominent political movements in Hammerfell, each based around a distinct Yokudan lineage with their own general opinions about the Empire, but the details are more complicated. First, the crowns and forebearers are not fixed groups, nor monolithic in their actions. Only a core subset of each group was actually descended from the Natotambu or the Ragada, with the remainder changing their loyalties whenever circumstances best fit. The best example of all would be the city of Sentinel itself, which adopted a more syncretic stance of both philosophies under the king Lotun. Beyond the major cities, the tribes of Hammerfell cared little for the affairs of the Empire. The core politics of both major political groups, while opposing each other, still kind of supported the Empire nonetheless. The forebearers were generally more progressive and willing to adopt imperial customs. The crowns, on the other hand, were determined to maintain their own identity, but still realized the benefits of working with the Empire. So everyone was willing to work with imperial authority, but they still didn't like each other very much. Considering that the majority of the local legions were recruited from tribes with loyalties on one side or the other, it's a recipe for civil strife, and only needing a global apocalypse to set things off. Daedra worship was abhorred, and therefore almost non-existent in Hammerfell, so the Oblivion crisis was pretty light in this province. The majority of the Daedra hordes fought along the coastlines and were thoroughly defeated by the local garrisons. The Battle of Sentinel is the best case of this. Lotun managed to unite the crowns and forebearers to put aside their differences and rally the populace to support the armies. Everywhere else, not so much. The sightings of Daedra was the perfect opportunity to accuse the other side of heresy, and local tribes took it upon themselves for vigilante justice. The Battle of Hagia Sophia is conversely the worst conflict in Hammerfell during the Oblivion crisis, despite a relatively small number of Daedra involved. The hordes were beaten back quickly, but the local Alimza, a firmly crown-aligned tribe, decided to use the conflict to raid and plunder forebearer Merquasa settlements to the east of Sentinel. Long after the Daedra were gone, the violence was still going on, and the Alakir Field Army and the 40th Legion were required to march east and quell the fighting. The battle dragged on for weeks, with raids and skirmishes pulling the armies all across the Alakir Desert. In the south, it was the forebearers who instigated the violence. Outside of Tanith, the Imperial forces were able to easily beat the hordes, but large detachments of the 27th were convinced that it was part of a crown conspiracy, and they took their vengeance out on the local Jelain tribes. Legate Lamil Alcaraz couldn't keep his soldiers under control and needed help from the 19th Legion in Rihad to keep order. While the casualties were minimal, it was one instance during the Oblivion crisis where legions were actively fighting against one another. The events of the Oblivion crisis were dramatic for Hammerfell, but mostly because it opened the floodgates for civil war which would emerge in its aftermath. The tensions between the crowns and forebearers was brewing for decades before the crisis, and the appearance of Daedra in the province was the auspicious event which pushed them over the edge. The crisis would also put Sentinel in a unique position to influence the events of Hammerfell, not only because of their syncretic politics, but also because a large portion of the Imperial legions in the province had garrisons in the city, specifically the Alakir Field Army. On paper, it was going to be a lost cause for the crowns. The forebearers had access to some of the richest cities in the province, and the remainder of the legions were stationed in forebearer-dominant towns. The conflict will be drawn out for years after the Oblivion crisis, and these battle-hardened legions will see action across the province as they're used to advance the agenda of ambitious politicians in Cyrodiil and Highrock. This section on Hammerfell was brief, but we'll have lots to talk about as our main story begins after the crisis ends. For now, we'll leave the province as it is. A fairly small Daedric invasion, but a massive civil war that's bound to erupt. Our tour of the north now brings us to the deep north, Skyrim, the birthplace of mankind. I left Skyrim and Highrock for last because, as our narrative moves forwards, it becomes ever so obvious that the Empire values these lands significantly more so than anywhere else in Tamriel. The relationship between the territories is clearly beneficial, and the Imperial infrastructure here reflects that. They have Imperial garrisons larger than the rest of Tamriel combined, and their generals are among the best the Empire has to offer. They are wealthy, they're able to largely supply their own troops for the legions. Skyrim is the model of an imperial province. An incredibly strong military kept up to strength not by internal turmoil, but a strong martial culture that brings out the best warriors. Its economic assets to the Empire are primarily agricultural, meaning it has tangible benefits even if, say hypothetically, a massive apocalypse breaks out across the entire continent, rendering gold or similar items much less valuable in the moment. Even still, Solitude is among the most prosperous trade hubs in northern Tamriel, and is a key base for the East Empire Trade Company. Skyrim really has everything going for it. The only thing to knock against it is its occasional desire for conquest, such as the War of the Bendermach from a couple decades back. But then again, you can't expect the provinces to always be at peace. Heck, I think Valenwood and Elsewhere would have some serious strikes against them if that were the case, not to mention the near constant strife going on in Highrock. But Skyrim knew not to bite the hand that fed it, at least at this moment in time, wink wink nudge nudge, and it was a good relationship. The Oblivion crisis here was fairly light, likely due to the Nords despising Daedra worship in all forms. However, the Mythic Dawn still were interested in the North for its strategic purpose for human morale. Also, if they could bog down the Empire's elite troops in Skyrim, then Cyrodiil would ultimately be weaker for the final invasion. When the gates opened, the eastern holds were hit much harder. Because Skyrim was relatively stable at the time of the crisis, many cities in its interior had walls which had been neglected for decades. The most problematic of those was Dawnstar, a coastal city used to defending from light raids from the Reekers and Ice Tribes, but were in no way prepared for the hordes of Oblivion. Mythic Dawn cultists had arrived little by little on trade vessels going into the city, infiltrating Dawnstar until they were ready to open a gate at the same time as many other cells in the province. When the Daedra arrived, the city's paltry walls were no defense. Dawnstar's governor Cyril Vintake took what few men he had at his disposal and tried to stall the Daedra while the citizens evacuated, but they could only hold for a few hours before they were overwhelmed. They left in boats as the city burned down, and it would take months before Cyril could get reinforcements from the 38th Legion in Whiterun and forces from Solitude to eventually retake the city. In the east, the residents of Winterhold were more fortunate, as they had mages of the college to help with the defense. The Daedra here were summoned from amongst the newly arrived Dunmer migrants, some of whom were Mythic Dawn agents. The battle was vicious and much of the city was still damaged, but the mages from the College of Winterhold were triumphant. They held off a horde that, proportional to how ready their defenses were, was much larger than many places saw. Their courage was a testament to their relationship with the city, at least until the Great Collapse. I guess it shows you that Nords are fickle in their ideas of mages. In the larger cities, the Nords managed to hold the Daedra with a combination of superior strength and the occasional heroic act. At the Battle of Windhelm, the aging Jarl Yispid Freeheart used the Thume to summon a giant spectral bear from Sovngarde that led the troops of the 16th Legion in a charge against the Oblivion Gate. They battled against the Daedric horde for nearly 2 days, but their strength was faltering. The Jarl and his son were killed in the violence, and the city was at its breaking point. In that moment, Thane Wilmec Stormcloak led his personal cadre of house guards and retainers into the gate itself to take the sigil stone. As the dust settled, the weary residents of Windhelm elected Wilmec as Jarl of Eastmarch. Huh. Stormcloak as Jarl of Windhelm. This probably won't go bad. Across Whiterun and the Rift, the Companions were a backbone of morale and martial tradition for the terrified residents. They fought at both the Battle of Riften and Whiterun, helping the Witch Queen Ishashe defeat the Daedric multiple times. To the far west, things were a bit more chaotic. It certainly didn't help that Skyrim had done its part in the recent war to destabilize its part of the Reach, as well as that in Highrock, and even the Dragonstar region in Hammerfell. On top of all of this, as we'll talk about in our last section, some of the Reachman tribes actively worked with the Mythic Dawn. Dragonstar was badly damaged during the invasion. The Daedra horde that attacked it wasn't large by any means. It was the division between the local Nords and Redguards that prevented any coherent defense of the city, and they were defeated piecemeal until the Daedra were gone. Markarth was fortunate in that it had allied itself with the right Forsworn tribes in the events leading up to the Oblivion crisis, but the rest of the Reach collapsed into civil war, an issue which we will further discuss in our last section on Highrock. The epicenter of Skyrim's fight against the Daedra was the Siege of Solitude. The de jure power of Windhelm and Winterhold could not ignore the de facto power that Solitude held as the center of imperial authority and commerce for the province. It would be the place of the largest battle as the Mythic Dawn decided to open a great gate outside of its walls. They did this to perfection, waiting until High King Theon had elected to send a large detachment to Dawnstar to retake the city. Merely days after they had left, the great gate opened, and not even the mighty fortified walls of Solitude could hold the Daedra. They pushed through the gates and even opened a second gate inside the market district itself. The full power of Solitude's legions and local troops struggled to contain the hordes, and they were slowly pushed back out of Castle Dower on their last legs as they tried to defend the Blue Palace. The hero of this story is a rather contentious one, Lothheim Ironskin. As our narrative continues to the aftermath of the crisis, we will see why he's so problematic, but for now, he will be the savior of Solitude. He was the commander of the Hafengar field army, which at the time was training in the hinterlands of Morthal. Only a few days' march from Solitude, he was able to march behind the advancing Daedra and trap them inside the city. But what's so problematic about this? Well, Morthal is only a 3 days' march from Solitude, but it took him 6 to get there. Was he purposely stalling his own arrival to garner fame and save his troops? Maybe not, but we can't say for sure. Either way, he arrived at the perfect time, and the field army was able to decisively pincer the hordes with the 11th Legion outside of the Blue Palace. He himself removed the sigil stone from the Great Gate, defeating a Dramara commander in one-on-one combat to do so. Much of Solitude was badly damaged, but the legions were triumphant, and Lothheim would become a national hero. With this triumphant battle, I think this is where we'll leave off for Skyrim. It was a slugfest between the legions and Nords against the hordes of Oblivion. They fared pretty well overall, but the destruction across the province will be too much for the young King Theon to handle. Local legion commanders will pick up the slack and will pull Skyrim into a queue in the years to come. Lastly, we begin our tour of Tamriel during the Oblivion crisis to Highrock. I wanted to end off with Highrock for its overall geopolitical importance in the coming decade. Even though the Thalmor will be on the rise, the Anzalil taking control over Black Marsh, the Dunmer on the verge of secession, Elswire in complete ruins, Hammerfell on the verge of civil war, and Skyrim on the verge of a political coup, it will be Highrock that has the most political clout to directly influence Cyrodiil in the direction of the Empire. It has a very strong military presence, a well-integrated imperial infrastructure, and a sophisticated political scene that is very intertwined with that of Cyrodiil's. It also has the aristocratic intrigue that breeds ambitious politicians that will do anything to seize power. Taken together, Highrock is an area that we should be paying attention to once the crisis is all over. The political climate of Highrock before the Oblivion crisis was already in crisis. A little more than a decade before, the region had been rocked by the miracle of peace, much more so than Hammerfell. After all, Sentinel was already a big deal before it consolidated its power. But Highrock? The warp in the west was a complete restructuring of the Breton political scene. Dozens of kingdoms had coalesced into a handful, and the scattered armies around the province focalized around them. The province was regularly dragged into conflict between neighboring states, and the Imperial Legion somehow managed to steer themselves clear from it. It was generally understood that they were there to enforce the law, and the rivalries between nations was something beyond and beneath their jurisdiction. The province had the largest army in Tamriel outside of Cyrodiil, as the importance of the Iliac Bay for trade and commerce cannot be understated. Highrock was perpetually in a state of petty war with itself in some form or another, which makes it a good place for fighting off an invasion. Of all the provinces we've discussed today, Highrock had by far the largest presence of Daedra worship. Like the High Elves of Alinor, powerful mages were used to cavorting with the various princes for favorings and offerings, even more so in the east, where it was a part of everyday life for the Reachmen. When the crisis started, it hit the province hard, almost to the same extent as Cyrodiil. Even beyond the copious conjurers, Highrock is of incredible importance to the Empire. It could survive without this territory, but it would be crippled financially doing so. If there was one place for the Mythic Dawn to focus on outside of Cyrodiil, and maybe perhaps Alinor, this is where they would strike. The Oblivion crisis in Highrock was a clash of the Titans. Massive armies met the Daedra in open battle, and it was widespread destruction. The full might of the most powerful cities like Daggerfall and Camlorn was enough to push the hordes back with only minimal damage to the city, and they would end up in a position to project their power throughout the province afterwards. Wayrest, the other major regional power, was not so fortunate. At the time that the gates began to open in Highrock, the majority of its army was actually away on campaign, marching with a large portion of the 39th Legion to put down a rebellion in Menevia. When the word had arrived that the city was under attack, the army was at least a 10 days march away. By the time they had returned to help defend the city, the majority of Wayrest had been destroyed. In a twist of fate, the rebels in Menevia actually fared pretty well during the crisis, at least until Wayrest was able to finally retaliate. The last victor of the Miracle of Peace, Orsinium, did fairly well too. After all, it was a kingdom in a perpetual state of being prepared for raids from its neighbors. When the Daedra arrived, they found a battle-hardened populace that was able to hold strong against wave after wave of attacks. With assistance from the 14th Legion, they were able to decisively defeat the hordes of Oblivion with no damage to the city. In the smaller cities, the crisis was much more difficult. In cities like Stormhelm and Evermore, the local armies relied on help from very unlikely places. The Lord of Stormhelm made an alliance with local vampire clans for their help in exchange to let them feed freely on unaffiliated travelers in the Rivenspire area. No way this arrangement could go bad in the future, but I guess desperate times call for desperate measures. In Evermore, the king was reluctant to deploy his forces outside of the city walls, and pleaded with the Bulse horseman tribes of the region for assistance. Although they had sworn loyalty to the king and were indeed able to help, it was a stab in the back for the tribesmen. The cowardice of the king in the face of the danger will be a permanent stain on his reign, which will haunt him in the coming years. To the east in the Reach, the violence was only exacerbated by the fact that many of the Reachman clans allied with the Mythic Dawn, and the entire cities of Farron and Johanna were razed under their combined forces. In other places, the Reachmen used the hordes to their advantage, pressing for political gain against their local rivals by commanding them. It erupted into a full-scale civil war between the clans that leaked into the neighboring territories. It took reinforcements from the 14th Legion in Orsinium and the Briton militia from Evermore to finally quell the situation months later. This all sounds chaotic enough, but this is even from the perspective of places that had armies. Decades of constant conflict in the region had localized the military within core cities, meaning that the countrysides were largely defenseless. In normal situations, this was okay, as they would still be fine relying on their patrons for supports. But when a crisis hits everywhere, nearly all at once, that help isn't coming, at least for a while. The cities of Highrock fared all right all in all, but the countryside was massacred. Alongside those smaller cities previously mentioned, Northmoor, Crosswich, and Markwastern were erased from existence, completely ransacked and demolished. If there is one long-term consequence of the Oblivion crisis that should be emphasized in Highrock, this is it. Because for centuries, the province had relied heavily on trade to keep its military and political ambitions afloat. From this mercantilist viewpoint, it's easy to forget about the farmers that kept the cities fed. The destruction of much of Highrock's farmlands will drive many cities and their allies into starvation and desperation. After all, there won't be much trade after the crisis ends. The province was the economic backbone of the empire, and it's going to be on the verge of mass famine after the crisis ends. The Imperial government is going to put more effort into saving Highrock than any other province, and this neglect for everywhere else will only exacerbate the problems that we have talked about in these past 2 episodes. So with that said, our tour of Tamriel during the Oblivion crisis is complete. The names and places are different, but we see similar themes all throughout. Where the Empire had the power, it did okay against the Daedra, but local political tensions will erupt in the disorder that is to come. Where the Empire didn't have that power, everything fell apart, whether literally like the disastrous battles in Elsweyr and Alinor, or metaphorically like in Black Marsh and Morrowind. Civil strife is going to be a gigantic issue moving forward, and the Empire will only have so much manpower and resources to help out. Who the Empire decides to help will forever define its relationship to the rest of Tamriel. So, join us in 2 weeks as we explore the Imperial infrastructure and military before and during the Oblivion crisis. Our series so far has shown mostly the ugly side of the Empire's efforts to help its residents, but what was going on behind the scenes? We'll talk about the organization of the Imperial Legion and its progressive evolution up to the event of the Oblivion crisis. We'll also talk about the Elder Council, its effects on global and local politics, and how it affected the Imperial infrastructure of Tamriel. We'll see how the legions of the late Third Era sparsely resemble those of Tiber Septim's centuries before. Specifically, we'll see how the invasion of Akavir by Uriel V forever changed the way the armies would be garrisoned and governed. It is from his reign that we can trace the origins of the field armies, and why these units were poised to become the dominant military entities in the aftermath of the apocalypse. We'll also see the extent to which the Elder Council dictated the affairs of Tamriel. Its power was legislative at best and an honorific at worst. Its authority fluxed with each emperor that came, and this general instability gave way to corruption and internal power struggles which leave the masses of Tamriel as collateral damage. How effective was Uriel VII at containing this? What sort of actors were left after the Oblivion crisis to exploit the power vacuum? I'm excited to get further into the details with you all. For now, thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoy the idea of this podcast, please like and subscribe, and you'll be the first to see when new episodes come out. We'll be making a Discord soon so you can chat with us and possibly contribute to the project. Until then, have a great rest of your day. Our background image for this episode was made from artwork by CohenR on DeviantArt. Even outside the Elder Scrolls genre, they have a lot of cool character art and even art for the Fallout universe, and I would definitely recommend checking them out and supporting them if you can. Our intro song is Jeremy Soule's King and Country from the Oblivion soundtrack, and our outro is Around the Fire from the Skyrim track. Links are available in the descriptions below.